O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Very thankful for our worship team. Do a great job. There's some good stuff. We're going to talk about patience today. And, often I have these moments where I say to God, somebody else has to give this sermon because I can't stand up here and talk about patience. I do not do well with patience, but I got the call, and I'm going to come, and I'm going to throw the ball here and seek to learn the process just as you, and allow God's word to speak to me. And I want us to start this morning. We're talking about patience in the form of the title, Waiting for Rain. Waiting for rain. And that, as Chad said, is very appropriate. For some of us, it's a matter of kind of just getting our lawns to look good, and my lawn is having a hard time. But for others, that's a much more serious proposition. Farmers and ranchers all over the state, people who are impacted by this drought, have very serious concerns about the weather. And I want you to know that in our day and age, in our modern age, we tend to come to expect certain things of God. And sometimes I think God interrupts those expectations to remind us that He is indeed faithful to give to us what we need, not when we want it, but when He is prepared to give it. And that He is God and we are not. And sometimes these little things are good reminders for us. I know they're serious, and I don't mean to make light of that for certain people. But James is going to talk about a farmer in his illustration today in James chapter 5. And he's going to talk about what was true back then, and that was much more than now, this expectation and trust in God to provide what was needed in His timing. And so we're going to look at that. I want to invite you to turn to James chapter 5. We're going to talk about patience, talk about waiting for rain. And I want to start off by having a little fun this morning, a little patience quiz. Okay, let's see how you do. Here's question number 1. You're at a toll booth on the Beltway. The driver in the car in front of you is having an extended conversation with the toll booth operator. How will you respond? A, you're happy. They're connecting. They're doing community at the toll booth. B, you think of things you'd like to say to the toll booth operator, like inviting him to church. Stuff like that, right? C, you attempt to drive your vehicle between the other person's car and the toll booth. Number 2, you've been sitting in the waiting room of your doctor's office for an hour. Oh. A, you're grateful for the chance to catch up on the 1993 Reader's Digest. B, in an attempt to empty the waiting room, you tell the other patients you have a highly contagious disease. Or C, you force yourself to hyperventilate in order to get immediate attention. Scenario number 3, this is for all you golfers. You're on the golf course, hole number 9. There's a group of 5 elderly gentlemen in front of you. They've taken 25 minutes on this one hole, and you're waiting to hit the ball up on the green. A, you wait patiently, enjoying the 103-degree temperature. B, you hit the ball up on them, yelling 4, secretly meaning for the ball to hit them on the forehead. C, you pray, God, they're old anyway. Please just strike them down and take them on to heaven. Now, we would never do any of those things, but, we flesh these out in our thoughts. These are quite casual circumstances that are a little irritating, right? A little frustrating. We kind of put up with them and endure them. But there are certainly in life much more serious situations of waiting and of needs for patience. The single person who is praying and waiting in hopes that God might provide a future spouse for them, the childless couple who has been praying and waiting and hoping and trusting that God might bless them with a child in some manner. The spouse who is in a troubled marriage, who feels trapped, who is waiting and trusting and seeking to be patient in that marriage. A person who's in a tough work situation, who desires to have a job that is more fulfilling, and they're trying to be patient and wait. And maybe even a depressed person who is looking for hope and who is living in the darkness of depression and seeking to have some light shine in their lives in some way, and waiting for things to change for them. So while there are minor irritations of life where we need patience, today I want to talk to you at a more serious level about the deep processes of patience in our life and what they really mean spiritually, because we indeed can wait for rain in a material and physical sense. But what we're going to talk about today is that goes to a deeper level in our lives of spiritual waiting and spiritual patience. And what it really translates to in our lives is faith and trust in God. It always does. And so let's look in James chapter 5. Now you remember James is writing to people in the first century who are becoming impatient. And he begins to close the book out by talking about this matter of patience, because these people here in the first century are becoming impatient because they are dealing with suffering. And he mentions that suffering. We talked about it last week, the suffering that's caused by the wicked, wealthy, the rich people who are oppressing them. He talks about it in chapter 1, the suffering that is accompanied with trials and tribulations, the suffering that is accompanied with temptation. And so here toward the end, he gives some words of encouragement. We started talking about it a little last week in light of the whole rich people oppressing the poor people. And he transitions now to those who are believers, those who are seeking to do the right thing, those who want to be authentic in their faith. And he says to them to be patient. So verse 7, James says this: "Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers." And by the way, how many of us begin to grumble when we become impatient? So that's why he's sticking this in here. These things are tied together. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Verse 10, "Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy." And we're going to stop right there. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So I want to share with you really 3 ideas from this passage that help us understand what it means spiritually to wait for rain. Well, let's first of all discuss what patience means in the first place, what waiting is really all about. Waiting means simply this: hopeful expectation. Hopeful expectation. And he uses the word patience. The word patience in the original language is the word macrothumeo. Now, as is common in Greek, it's kind of a compound word. Macro, you've heard before. There's an English transliteration of that, macroeconomics. Oftentimes we think that macro means big or large. It could be applied in that sense, but macro really means, in the original language, long. It means long, stretching across. Or it could mean broad. And then thumeo comes from the Greek word thumos, which literally means anger. To heat up is the idea. So you say, well, is James saying that we should be long in anger? Having a lot of angry? No, he's saying be long-tempered, as opposed to what? Being short-tempered. Being long in the expression of anger. Long-suffering is the idea. So, slow to anger, long-suffering is what patience actually means, and he uses the illustration of waiting for rain. And again, we can understand that in kind of our minor way, but to the farmers, it was very, very serious. Rains, adequate rains in the Mediterranean area only flowed twice a year. And one was in the autumn during the planting season, and one would be in the spring right before the harvest. So in between, the farmer would do work. He would wait. But biblical waiting, by the way, is not just kind of sitting idly by and passively kind of waiting on God. It's not an excuse for laziness. It's not an excuse for us not doing our part. Biblical waiting has the ideal of working and doing our part in the processes of God and then letting God do his part, understanding what is our business and what is none of our business, understanding what we are to do as called by God, but then understanding where that line is drawn and how God does all the rest. That's biblical waiting. So it's not an excuse to not face up to certain realities. It's not an excuse for laziness. It's not an excuse for appropriate action. It's not an excuse for taking responsibility and doing what we should be doing. I've had people rather spiritually say, we're waiting on God. I'm like, are you doing anything while you're waiting? What does God ask you to do? What is he wanting you to follow through on? So those who are in some kind of financial trouble, who have worked their way into some financial mess, and we're waiting on God. Okay, this isn't Monopoly, It's not like you're going to get that card that says, bank error in your favor, collect $200. What are you doing? And in fact, God will use these situations to prompt us to action, understanding what we are to do and to teach us that we are to do certain things in order to also trust God with what he can only do. So the farmer does his part. And then he waits for God to do his, understanding carefully the difference between those two. So hopeful expectation is a long-suffering, being slow to getting angry, worried, fretful, frightened of the situation. Secondly, this passage teaches that waiting means cooperating with the processes of growth. Cooperating with the processes of growth. And oh my, how important this is. The farmer, maybe unlike any other occupation, the farmer keenly understands the processes of time and what must take place in time. He understands the idea of development, that there's a seed, there's a sprout, there's a plant, and then ultimately there's the yielding of crops. He understands that you cannot shortcut any of those processes. That when you have the right context, that these things naturally occur on their own as God blesses, but that there is a beginning, there is a maturation stage, and then there is a product. And so the farmer understands that he cannot fight against those processes. He cannot fret and worry. You can imagine being a farmer and being worried. Being a worrier and being fretful and frightened. It's not the occupation you want to go into if you're impatient, right? Understanding that God has to do his part in these processes. And so, there are seasons to growth. Seasons of summer and winters and springs. Now, the opposite is what gets you and me in a bunch of trouble in our lives. We expect microwave maturity. We expect things rather quickly. How many of you have been impatient waiting for certain things that in our day and age really come pretty quickly? You're waiting in the Starbucks line, you're waiting at the fast food restaurant, for quick food. You're impatient waiting for the microwave to finish the popcorn. These are minor irritations, but they illustrate the expectations of our lives and how more and more we are ramping up those expectations, and more we are accelerating the rate at which we expect things should occur. And we need to come back to the whole agricultural metaphor and understand it keenly, that in our processes of growth, that God uses summers and winters and springs and times of drought and times of abundant rain to accomplish what He wants. Let me tell you, it is expectations that get us in trouble with respect to our patience. It is us expecting certain things. Think about it. That's what it's all about. Expecting certain things and those things not working out. Expectations not being met, not being achieved. It's what it's all about. And rather than investigate the whole assumption behind the expectation as to whether we should assume that this expectation should be met in this time frame, what do? We just think it should be and become impatient about it. Instead, maybe we ought to rewind the tape a little bit and say, what are our expectations really all about? What are they rooted in? What are the motivations behind those expectations? Are they selfish? Are they rooted in worry and fear? Are they rooted in a lack of faith? You see, we have impatience when we don't understand that the best things in life are not easy and are not instant. I mean, that's just a truism of life. And so the analogy of the seed is just about perfect. Just about everything in life begins at the seed stage. The development of our children, the way that God made it, it starts small, and there's a lot of ups and downs. But ultimately, that crop is yielded. Marriage begins in seed stage. But we expect our marriage to be at the product stage of development, not in the seed stage. And so what happens? We preempt God of the opportunities to work in our lives. We preempt God of the processes of growth in our life by taking shortcuts or by leaving, by escaping. And rather than having long suffering, we have short suffering. Because after all, we don't like suffering. And we want it now. And we totally lose out on many of the other things that God is seeking to develop within you and me. And so James shares these illustrations. And by doing so, he talks about different types of patience. Let's see if your impatience, your problems with this thing of patience falls into any of these categories, okay? 3 types of patience. First of all, patience in life's uncontrollables. The illustration of the farmer. You've learned that there's much of life that you cannot manage or control, right? If you don't learn that, you will be an impatient person. You will take responsibility for things that are none of your responsibility. You will try to control things that are out of your control. And the result will be a lack of patience. Patience in life's uncontrollables. Secondly, patience in the response of people. James talks about the prophets. In verse 10, brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. So what was the job of the prophet? To go and speak and to proclaim God's truth. Now, a lot of times the prophets wanted to see a response as a result of that. They wanted to control the outcomes as a result of that. But many times, and we see it time and time again in the Old Testament, as the prophets spoke, many of them got no response. And yet God called them to be faithful to preach and to teach and to speak His word. And they needed patience in the face of that kind of suffering. Patience in the response of people. You and I do certain things to get certain responses. And isn't it frustrating when we do those certain things, we don't get the response from people that we want? So it's not just patience in circumstances. It's patience with respect to relationships and people and what we think they ought to give back in return. Setting expectations that are not met. And then the third form of patience is patience in the pain of suffering. He talks about Job and Job's perseverance. He says in verse 11, "You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about." So you know about Job's suffering, right? Lost most of his family except for his wife, which, by the way, may have been a form of suffering. Now, I don't know why God took everybody else but not his wife, but maybe that was a part of the whole deal there. Some of you are going, yeah, you're right. Became very, very unhealthy, suffered tremendous pain, and all through those 41 chapters of the book of Job, Job is wrestling with this. And he's got friends that are coming to him and telling him why he's suffering and what he should have done and what he didn't do and the fact that he sinned. They're trying to give him a theology lesson of some kind. And Job says, "Though he slay me, yet will I serve him." Finally, toward the end of the book of Job, you need to read it. If you're going through suffering, if you're going through pain, and you need some patience, you need to read the book of Job. By the end of the book of Job, Job is asking God certain questions. And God basically does not answer him. God says to Job, "I'm sorry. Were you there when I placed the sun in the sky? When I created the oceans and the mountains? Were you there when the stars were painted in the universe?" And then Job repents at the end and says this, "My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." And I just want to remind you today, I want to remind myself, that many times sufferings with respect to certain situations and uncontrollables, suffering with respect to people, even sufferings in the painful physical ailments of life, those are sufferings to remind us that God is ultimately in control. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily God brought them to you. He did in Job's situation. Sometimes pain and suffering is a result of our own dumb choices. And we shake our fist at God and say, "God, why did you do this?" When He didn't do it, you did it. And you made a decision that resulted in suffering of some kind. Sometimes suffering is a result of other harmful people who do things toward us. Sometimes suffering is the direct result of God bringing things into our lives to teach us certain things. And in Job's situation, it was to teach him about God's faithfulness and that God was all-powerful. But those things in our lives which cause us impatience should be like the warning light on the dashboard of our cars. They should illustrate that there's something else going on that we need to maybe look under the hood and investigate. That it's not about that person necessarily. It's not about that situation. It's about our hearts toward God. And it's about you and me cooperating with God in the processes of growth. Not to buck it, not to rebel against it, not to run from it, but to cooperate with Him. When we do, we're able to find patience and long-suffering in our lives. The third concept here behind this idea of waiting and patience is this. Waiting means giving to God what we would normally try to hold on to ourselves. Giving to God what we would normally try to hold on to ourselves. Now, I've already mentioned that, but it's important enough to clarify this one little point here. One of the toughest things in our lives is to let go of people and circumstances, is to let go. One of the toughest things in our lives is to realize that we are not in control. So waiting and patience, please hear this. Waiting and patience is something that by its very nature can be done only by the humble. The prideful, the arrogant are those who will have trouble being patient, are those who will have trouble waiting. So, by nature, having patience means to let go of an expectation of some kind and to trust God with that person or that situation that we're facing. So, by nature, patience is an act of faith. Patience is an act of worship. It's more about God and me than it is about another person or another circumstance. It doesn't matter what you're going through. Ultimately, patience is about our faith in God. So here's a principle for patience as we close today. Here's a principle for patience that I want to share with you. You've got to get this. Here's the principle. What God does in us while we wait is, in fact, just as important as the object for which we are waiting. What God does in us while we wait is just as important as that for which we are waiting. He seeks to do something in you in the processes of growth, in the processes of patience, that only can take place through these situations, these people that come along in our lives. And oh, how I wish that wasn't so. In the small, irritating frustrations of life and in the larger ones, if we took the time to think a little deeper, if we took the time to roll back and think about our motivations, think about what's going on, if we took the time to pray in those situations and connect the dots, we might be able to see patterns of God bringing people and circumstances in our lives that cause us to be impatient because He has a certain thing that He wants to work on in our lives. And that thing, I would say to you, is much more important or just as important as the thing for which you're waiting. So what is it He's trying to beat out of you? I know mine. What is it He's trying to correct in you? What is it He's trying to straighten out in your life? I would guarantee one thing, that no matter what it is, no matter what category it falls under, I would guarantee you one thing. It is about Him trying to make you more Christ-like in your character. He wants you to look more like Jesus. Folks, think about, ever since the day you became a Christian, the one thing that God has been wanting to do in your life is to make you Christ-like in your character. It is the process of sanctification. Now, that's a nice theological term, and we don't often apply it as we should. Simply means us developing where we reflect the character of Christ, where we become authentic disciples of Jesus. That's what He wants. And listen, He will bring people and circumstances and situations that cause you to be impatient. He will bring them your way in order to mold and shape your character. Not because He's toying with you, not because He doesn't love you, but because your heart and your development is what is of utmost concern to Him. It's not the situation. It's not the person. It's not you getting what you want when you want it. It's about you becoming a person of faith who loves and trusts God authentically. And He wants that for each and every one of us. And guess what? If you flunk that test, you get re-enrolled in the class. It's like a prerequisite thing, get automatically re-enrolled. And so you're in a situation, it causes you frustration and impatience, you bolt. A couple of years later, you find yourself in another situation. Different context, same problem. you bolt. 2 years later, you find yourself in another situation. So you have conflict with a person, you run away. 2 or 3 years later, different person, same conflict. See, God's trying to teach you. And yet, we're having these experiences and we're missing the meaning behind the experiences. As people of faith, please understand that God is trying to do something in your life that reflects Jesus in some way. And so it is really a matter of faith where we give to God what we would normally try to hold on to ourselves. And so in these situations, in these relationships, when you've done all that you can and you feel as though you've responded as you should, that you've done the work that God has asked you to do, that you've handled this person the way that you should, then all you can do at that point is to pray and trust and to let go. You can't control other people. You can't control all situations in your life. And when you can't, God says, this is an opportunity of faith. You going to trust me? You going to look deep? Or are you going to whine? You going to complain? You going to leave? You going to walk through this? Or are you going to try to walk around it? Because I have this in your life for the good. And if you, with humility, will walk through this and long suffer, there will be an outcome of some kind. And more likely that outcome will be that you will look more like Jesus. But it's hard, isn't it? Gosh, it's hard. That's why I didn't want to preach this today. It's hard. It's tough. So often we don't see life with these spiritual lenses. We don't see God working. After all, it's hard to see the seed when all we see is the dirt, isn't it? But the seed is under the ground. And it's developing. It's behind the scenes. It's unseen, but something is happening. God is working in some way to trust Him. And then James talks about all this. Let me just finish. James talks about all this in the context of the Lord's return. He refers to it a few times in the whole book, but here he says, "Be patient then, brothers," in verse 7, "until the Lord's coming." And he talks about how the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. The judge is standing at the door, that the Lord is coming. And so here is what he is wanting to say in the midst of frustration and impatience, in the suffering, the real suffering that they were going through, the persecution that they were going through. He's saying, always remember that what you're going through is temporary. And that the Lord is coming. And that we should live as people of faith who have our eyes on heaven. That's something more lasting, something more eternal. And that Jesus one day is coming back. And He's going to make all things right. Hold on till then, He says to them. Hold on to them. So, what kind of people are in your life that are causing you impatience? What kind of circumstances are in your life that are causing you impatience? Maybe what kind of health issues and physical sufferings are you facing in your life that are causing you impatience? God says, hold on. Hold on. In humility, trust me. And even if you have to walk through it. By the way, don't you wish that God would just remove these situations, these people, these physical ailments? Just remove them, just take them away. Unfortunately, He doesn't work on the same economy as you and I. He's got other things in mind. And He's asking us to have faith in Him working those things in our life. So let's bow our heads.